Well, good evening, folks. Good evening. How are you guys doing this evening? Great. That's good. How did you enjoy that beautiful sunny day out there? I thought that was amazing. That was a great day to have. Guys, we're really excited to have Steve Kim with us this evening. Had the pleasure of spending some time with him this afternoon. And back when the staff was planning this event, we were just like, oh, it'd be cool to have a speaker from Apologetics Canada in. And so they kind of put me on the job of finding which speaker to get. And so I kind of went onto their website and I started to look and started to read some qualifications. And then I saw another bald guy with like wide rim glasses, and I was like, this is the guy. This is who it's got to be. So that's really why we chose Steve, just because he has a great haircut and great glasses. But super excited to have him with us this evening. Steve's been with Apologetics Canada for 10 years, and he's currently working on his PhD at the University of the Highlands in Ireland. And he's studying transhumanism, which quite an interesting topic to talk to him about, I am sure. So he is going to come. He's speaking to us tonight on tongue-tied and how to have really good and logical conversations with people about Jesus. So let me pray, and then we'll welcome Steve to the stage. Father, I just want to thank you for this evening. Lord, again, for the privilege of being here to learn from you, and Lord, through Steve. And Lord, I just want to pray that you would just help us to learn tonight, help us to listen. And then, Lord, see, even as Steve is sharing with us, Lord, be thinking about who we can be talking to about the things that we're learning tonight, or who we can have better conversations with based on what we're learning tonight. And so, Lord, I just pray that you would use this evening not just to further our knowledge, Lord, but further our ability to reach others for you. So I just thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Just welcome Steve to the stage, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good evening. Am I coming through? Okay. Thank you so much for having me here. I have to say, our gracious Lord has blessed me with many a good thing in life, but robust hair follicles wasn't one of them. And at some point in my mid-20s, I started noticing that thinness on the top of my head, and I struggled mightily against it, and eventually I thought to myself, sometimes, there's no honor in fighting and losing battles, so I just jumped into it. I really had to prepare my then 2-year-old daughter. I was just like, Daddy's going to look a little different. But yeah, thank you so much for having me here. It's been a real pleasure to come to Lloydminster. I've only been here this is my second time here. And the last time I was here was some 16 years, and I almost didn't recognize it when I drove in with Parker and Emma. By the way, thanks for driving me all the way from Edmonton. Let me start by just sharing a little bit more about myself. Who am I? Who is Steve Kim? Without getting too philosophical, probably the most important thing that you should know about me is that I'm an undeservedly adopted son of God Most High, who not only offered clemency to this rebel who committed high treason, but saw in his good pleasure to adopt this forgiven rebel so that he could give his kingdom. That just blows my mind. I can understand how a king might offer pardon to a criminal, but then for God to take that one step further and say, but you are now going to be my son, and I'm going to give you my kingdom to reign in it with Christ. That's me, but that's also you. If you're here professing Jesus to be your Lord and Savior, that is what you're destined for. That is what has been sealed by the blood of Christ. And we're going to be doing eternity together. You're kind of, like it or not, you're stuck with me for eternity. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'll leave that up to you to decide. But that's Romans 8, by the way. That's very much not it. I'm also a family man. There's my family. I married Sharina, I think it's going on 14 years now. I should know this, but yes, 14 years, right, 2010. Otherwise, my wife would hang me. There's my daughter Maya, she's 10 years old. My son Tavin, he's 8. Husband to one, father to two. They're joys of my life. I'm also just a really normal guy. I like to play video games, eat instant ramen noodles, and sometimes do both at the same time, which can be quite messy, but I'm just a very normal guy. But like Pastor Bruce said, I also serve as the Alberta Director for Apologetics Canada. Our motto is love God, love people, and equipping the Christian community with a biblically sound, intellectually robust, and culturally engaged faith. You can learn more about us at apologeticscanada.com. And we have a weekly podcast where we try to offer a Christian perspective to the cultural issues of our day, cultural issues, theological issues, biblical issues, and everything in between. Now, if you're not familiar with that word apologetics, it has nothing to do with actually apologizing. Because, you hear the word apologetics and what comes to mind, right? I mean, what are we apologizing for in Canada again this time? But it has nothing to do with actually saying sorry, although that may not be a bad idea in some cases. But that word apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia. You find that in 1 Peter 3:15, where Peter says, "But in your heart, set apart Christ as Lord, always being prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, but do it with gentleness and respect." That word, give an answer, is the word apologia. And interestingly, today in modern Greece, they still use that word in the court of law when a lawyer speaks in defense of his client, so on and so forth. So apologetics is that branch of theology that seeks to offer the rational basis for the truth of Christian claims, and that's what we are doing. I believe there is a video after this. There is of all the resources that we have out there, the one that I'm personally really excited about is this brand new video resource that we just released this morning. Actually, I sent out the emails before I came here. It's called Can I Trust the Bible? It's a 2-part video series, and it's going to be an ongoing thing, so there will be more coming. And my colleague Andy and Wes, they did a wonderful job of putting this together. So we're just going to watch just a quick trailer so you get a kind of sense of what it's like.
Andy and Wes here from Apologetics Canada. We're in Egypt working on a new project called Can I Trust the Bible?
Well, you might be asking the question, well, why are Andy and I here in Egypt to talk about the complexities and issues regarding the Bible? Well, the reality of it is the vast majority of those handwritten copies, what we call the manuscripts of the Bible, and particularly the earliest ones, come from Egypt.
And with your doctoral work in the area of theology and manuscripts, what got you interested in the Bible?
I realized that I was engaging with a lot of people, skeptics of all different stripes, and all of them would resort to some sort of, well, that sounds great, Wes, but all you're relying on is the Bible. That's your foundation. And you can't trust that. All you have are translations of translations of translations. All you have are error-ridden copies. You don't even know if you have the right books. You're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but have you ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? And so I realized that if that was true, I'm staking my entire life on the person of Jesus. And where do I find the information about Jesus? I find that in the Bible. And if I can't trust the Bible, I really have no reason to put my hope and trust in Jesus.
So if you're interested in that, check it out, bible.apologeticscanada.com. It's out there completely free. We don't make a dime off of it. We're offering it to you as a ministry resource, and I hope you find that helpful. So tonight we're going to talk about preparing ourselves for gospel conversations. I think you and I would agree that in our day and age, having good conversations is becoming more and more difficult. And so what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the mindset going into these potential conversations and how we can prepare ourselves long term And then finally, what are some tips and tactics that we can use on the spot, conversational tips and tactics that we can use to talk to our friends and our neighbors, just for a good conversation, many of which hopefully will include important gospel conversations. And then we'll have a time of I don't like to call it Q&A. I like to call it Q&R because A just makes me feel pretentious. But we're going to have a time of Q&R, and we'll see what is burning on your heart to talk about tonight. So let's jump into that. First thing is the mindset. The mindset. Now, when I talk about, this strategy or that tactic or that mindset, I have to preface it by saying sometimes the Holy Spirit can just kibosh all of that. So let me just put that caveat out there. It all depends on the situation and what the Holy Spirit is doing at that time. But here is a way that we can prepare ourselves to have good gospel conversations with our friends and family and coworkers. So first, the mindset. The first thing I want to say is let's have a realistic expectation. I think, again, you and I would agree that our culture isn't where it was, say, 30 years ago, even, right? When I was growing up, sometimes I was told, if you have just 5 minutes, just pull out John 3:16, right? Go there. Now, I do believe that God's word is powerful, whether that the other person believes it or not. It has an impact on them. I want to acknowledge that. But at the same time, I think we need to understand that if I just go to John 3:16, what is my friend going to say? Now, my friend who doesn't believe in God, what is he going to say? What would you say if you didn't believe in God? And I just pull out John 3:16. What would you say? Why is that true? Why bother? Why should I? Right? It was one thing when our culture in general kind of had some kind of reverence and respect for the Bible, but we don't live in that culture anymore. There was a time when CBC radio had morning devotionals every morning. We don't live in that culture anymore. Can you imagine CBC doing morning devotionals? I mean, come on. In Canada, really? Yes, there was a time, but we don't live in that time anymore. A lot of my high school friends, I went to a public school, a lot of my high school friends, most of them were atheists and agnostics, so they didn't believe in God. But the funny thing was almost all of them had come from some kind of a church background. By the time I knew them, they had all walked away, and they had this kind of been there, done that mentality. So, for example, if I bring up John 3:16 with them, they're not even there on the same page with me. So I have to take a few steps backwards and start from way over here. So all that it means is we need to have a realistic expectation, and that sort of just pull out John 3:16 mentality can be problematic. Again, I have to emphasize it depends on what the Holy Spirit is doing. But we got to be careful with that in some ways because it can boil down to a few things. One is we can get into this soul-saving mentality where we're so busy with saving that person's soul as if salvation belonged to me and what I did. But salvation is the work of God, is the work of the Holy Spirit, and I need to follow his leading in that. And it's not a magical thing where if I just pop out John 3:16, magically something might happen. I mean, who knows what the Holy Spirit will do. But sometimes we can get into the mindset of, well, if I just do this, this other thing will happen. I don't think that's necessarily true. And secondly, again, we tend to, like I said, we tend to put that pressure on ourselves to save that person. So instead, what I try to do in my daily conversations with anybody really, and especially somebody who doesn't see things eye to eye, then I just try to give him something to think about at the end of the conversation. Right? Hopefully I can put a pebble in his shoe so that my friend hobbles away, right, just slightly annoyed in a good way. Give him something to think about. That is my goal. So my hope is that whatever seeds that have been sown today, God will do something with it. Right? I just want to be faithful in that small part that I can play. I don't want to have this grand vision of me being some kind of master evangelist that, just every time I pull out whatever Bible verse it is, my friend just comes down on his knees weeping, receiving Jesus as the Lord and Savior. Like, I don't think I need to put that pressure on myself because, again, salvation is the work of God. So that's what I mean. And I think I've covered that enough. And the next thing I want to say is let's have a healthy curiosity about the other person. And I say healthy. Can I just emphasize that? Let's not be weird. Healthy curiosity. And we'll come back to that. Did I? There we go. So I say that because sometimes people, if you have this view where you reduce the person to a salvation project, people can smell that from a mile away, and they will not want to talk to you because they understand that the reason that we're befriending them is for some other reason than to actually befriend them, right? And nobody likes that. So what I'd like to suggest is maybe we should honor the other person by engaging them in conversation and learning about them. In other words, be a student. Learn about their family, their history, favorite restaurants, pet peeves, etc., etc. Is he or she an animal person? What kind of books do they like to read? What are their opinions on a particular political issue? You don't have to shy away from that. What's their idea of a successful person? What's their motto in life? So on and so forth. So here's an action item that I would like to suggest. Start a conversation with somebody that perhaps you see on a somewhat regular basis and ask them questions to get to know them, right? So you might say something like, hey, listen, I've known you for some time now, but I never really thought to ask, what are your thoughts on X, Y, and Z? Now here's the rule. When you do this, just listen, and the point isn't to try to refute them, just listen and understand. Listen and understand. The goal is to get to know the person and understand where that person's coming from, not to refute their views. It may come to that later, but first thing is let's get to know the person. Now, there is a quote that's often misattributed to Aristotle. Aristotle never really said this, but a lot of people think he said this, and I like it nonetheless. And according to this misattribution, apparently, Aristotle said, he didn't, but apparently he said, the mark of an educated mind is the ability to entertain ideas without accepting them. The mark of an educated mind is the ability to entertain ideas without accepting them. In other words, when you are just listening and you're asking clarifying questions and you're trying to understand that person's viewpoint, even if you don't agree with it, just trying to understand their view doesn't mean that you're actually accepting their views, right? Okay, tell me about your views on sexuality and gender, for example. That's a hot topic these days, isn't it? Tell me what you think about this. Help me understand, right? And you understanding doesn't mean that you accept it. So I don't think we need to be afraid of actually seeking understanding. Understanding doesn't mean acceptance. And as you talk to the person, sometimes conversation runs dry. I mean, if you're done with the conversation, you're done with the conversation. But you know what it's like, right? Especially if you have kids who are in their teenage years. I mean, I'm already getting this from my kids, and they're only 10 and 8. You know those notorious one-word answers? How was school? Good. Fine. What'd you learn? Stuff. Did you have a good day? Yeah. You know, that sort of thing, right? So this phrase, to me, is almost magical. So when my daughter, for example, starts kind of, it's not that she's trying to be disrespectful. Sometimes she's very much kind of lost in her own thoughts, and it's hard to kind of pull her out of that to have a conversation. So if she's in that mode, I'll often just say, tell me more. And I just bite my tongue and leave it there. Tell me more. And usually she has more that she wants to say. Well, how was your time at your friend's birthday party? It was great. Okay, tell me more. Right? And then you can kind of draw up more conversation that way. So I would encourage that. And then another thing that you can do is the power of paraphrasing is quite amazing. So as you're talking to your friend, coworker, whatever, when they tell you something, put it in your own words and then give it back to that person for feedback. Right? So you might say something like, so what I'm hearing you say is da 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 da. Is that a fair description of what you said? Or I just want to make sure that I understood you correctly. Tell me if I got it right or not. Are you saying X, Y, and Z? The one that I particularly like is, just so I don't end up putting words in your mouth, are you saying X, Y, and Z? So I put it in my own words, give it back to that person for feedback. That's the critical step, is you give it back to that person for feedback. It does several things. One is that person will feel heard. Okay, this guy is actually trying to understand what I'm saying and not try to misrepresent me. And he's asking me to make sure that he got it right. And another thing that it does is, if I got it wrong, I get corrected. So I actually understand that person's point of view, and when I'm engaging, I'm not just knocking down straw men. Right? Do you know that phrase, knocking down straw men? That's like a fallacy, right? You have some distorted version of what that person's actually saying, refute that, and you think to yourself, I just refuted that person's viewpoint. That's a logical fallacy. And it makes you look really dumb. Let's not do that, right? Looking dumb is not a Christian virtue, so let's not do that. So, I should be careful, because sometimes what we believe in the eyes of the world, what we believe can come off really stupid. To the Jews, stumbling block; to the Greeks, foolishness, that sort of thing. But let's not rush into that with our own sort of lack of caution, shall we say. So as you talk to that person, try that. Paraphrase it, give it back to that person for feedback, and see where that goes. And if the conversation starts to run dry, just say, well, tell me more. The next one, have a charitable view about the other person. I'm going to show you a short video clip where this conservative political commentator, Dan Bongino, is having a conversation with Geraldo Rivera from Fox News, and they're having a conversation about the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of times people think this is what apologetics looks like, so let's take a look here.
Only accept facts that you
black Americans
agree with.
In the course of each day. If there was a plague of police officers hunting black men down at night, then I don't understand. If that's happening, where is all this massive body count we would see?
This man,
He's
Sean, this man is why they have that rage.
Data
this
to back
man
it up.
with this baloney.
He doesn't know anything about that woman.
He doesn't
know anything about that woman. Anything. He's injecting race into the argument because he has nothing else.
Mr. Rhetoric.
That's why.
Right. You tell that to the black families that see their sons being killed.
That's all you
twice
got.
the rate
you
of
got
white
nothing else,
sons.
buddy. You've got nothing else.
That's a fact.
You've got nothing else. All you want to do is see the country burn. You just want to see the country burn. That's it.
I want to see the country burn. You son of a... I want to see the country burn, you punk. You're nothing but a punk.
Yeah.
You're a punk.
Yeah.
Have you had a conversation like that? Oh man, I've had a few of those, and I don't want to repeat that ever again. It's quite embarrassing. But notice what happened. Where did Geraldo Rivera lose his cool? I mean, both of them kind of lost their cool to begin with, but Geraldo Rivera especially, there was a moment when he really lost it. When was it? Sorry? Sorry, I'm having a hard time. Oh, when he started stirring. So that showed when he started calling him a punk, right? It shows that he kind of lost his cool. But the other guy said something that actually set that off. What do you think that was? Sorry, somebody said that. You want to see the country burn. You want to see the country burn. That's when Geraldo Rivera really lost it. You're nothing but a punk. Right? So what happened there? Sometimes we read malice into a situation where there really isn't one. And if you know Geraldo Rivera, I mean, the guy loves his country. Right? You may disagree with his views on certain political issues, but I mean, the guy loves his country. We see this all the time in political discourse today, where we just read malice into one another. Whatever they say, we just read malice into it. And that is a really good example of how a conversation can break down when we read malice into. So the reason for that is this. If you think the other person is completely corrupt and evil, you're not going to want to have a conversation with that person, right? So when we have a charitable view of the other person, it does two things. For one, it opens us up for conversation, right? Sometimes we as Christians have an exaggerated sense of persecution. There are instances of real persecution, but sometimes we can have an exaggerated sense of it. People are generally quite open to talking about spiritual things. Sometimes people find this a little surprising. In my line of work, in my 10 years working with Apologetics Canada, I have never met an atheist who was really rude to me. I disagree with them a lot on a lot of things, but just about every atheist that I've talked to in person, face to face, they're quite cordial. And it was interesting because growing up, I always had this view of this angry atheist, right? Especially in the age of social media. You do see a lot of atheists who are just really mean, but then I've seen Christians who are also very mean. Social media just isn't a very good, it's not a shining beacon of human communication excellence. You know what I'm saying? It's just not that. There's this sociologist by the name of George Yancey. Now, I know there are a couple of George Yanceys out there. This one is not that George Yancey, depending on who you have in your mind. Sociologist George Yancey says the perception by the general public of Christians is actually quite positive, except in the university, he says. So we can sometimes have this exaggerated sense of persecution. But yeah, people are generally quite open. Again, start a conversation, see where it goes. People are really, really rude face to face. And secondly, it opens the other person up for conversation, right? You saw what happened. Geraldo Rivera, at some point, he shut down the conversation. He didn't want to have a conversation anymore. He resorted to name calling. Now, again, I believe God's word is powerful. Sometimes people do need to hear prickly things. But as a rule, I don't bring up passages like Romans 1 right from the get-go and start telling people that you're children of God's wrath and you're just suppressing truth out of your unrighteousness. I don't start there, right? There may be a time to bring that up. And better yet, if my friend who's not a believer in God comes to that conclusion on his own, that's the best, right? Let God's word speak for itself and prick people's conscience. I don't necessarily need to bring that up as a bludgeoning weapon right from the get-go. There may be a time for it. Once trust has been built in this relationship, I may be able to bring that up carefully, but as a rule, I don't just start there. Again, who knows what the Holy Spirit might do? There might be a place for that where I just come out swinging. But as a general rule, I don't start there. I want to build a good relationship with that person first. Now, this is where we need a bit of a long-term prep. Okay, so I just want to start this segment by saying, again, this is long-term preparation. This is something that you should be working on day in and day out. Like, you don't have to spend all day doing this, but communication is something that we do day in and day out anyway. So as you're doing that, as you're doing what you're already doing, let's keep some of these things in mind. And I have to say, there is some audience participation involved here, and there may be some things I'm like, I don't get this. That's fine. We all have to start somewhere. It does take a little bit of practice. It's like playing an instrument. Anybody who picked up an instrument understands if you want to get from point A to point B, learning an instrument, you have to make a lot of mistakes along the way. And it's not an instant kind of, oh, I get it kind of a thing. Can be that, but it's very rare. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is let's practice analyzing an argument. Analyzing an argument. Now, when I say argument, I don't mean like what Dan Bongino and Geraldo Rivera were doing, like a shouting match. That's not what I mean. Sometimes the word argument can be something of a dirty word in many Christian circles, right? Because it brings up images of people locked in a heated quarreling that produce more heat than light. But in the technical sense of the word, an argument is when you have a claim and the supporting reasons, right? So if I use two terms from logic, you have a conclusion, you have the premises. The conclusion is the point that you're trying to make. The premises are the reasons why, right? So on social media, when you go on social media, a lot of the times what you see people do is they make claims and they think they made arguments. Like, okay, I understand you think, for example, right, carbon tax is hurting the farmers. Great. Can you back that up, right? So then you might bring in some statistics, how people are, maybe even anecdotal evidence, right? All those things can come in to support the claim that you're making. But just making the claim isn't an argument. Not, when you talk to people, you don't just tell people this is the case. You tell people this is the case and here's why. You understand what I'm saying here? That's an argument. So let's practice analyzing an argument. We'll do some quick practices. This is the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution, right? It's the infamous Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. What is the point that is making here, and what is the reason why? Believe it or not, it's a form of an argument. So what is the point being made, and how is it, what's the rationale for it? Does anybody want to take a shot? Right. So that's exactly right. So the point is the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Why? Because a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a state. Okay, well, let's do another one. Thomas Aquinas argued that human intelligence is a gift from God, and therefore to apply human intelligence is to apply human intelligence to understand the world is not an affront to God, but is pleasing to him. So Thomas Aquinas offered an argument. What is the conclusion that he's offering? Anybody else want to take a stab? I know Parker gets it, but anybody else want to take a stab at it? Yeah, human intelligence is a gift from God. Now, let me give you a hint. I appreciate that you took a stab at it. When you see the word therefore, that kind of gives it away. Therefore, that word actually signals that whatever follows it is the conclusion. So, what's the conclusion? Right. That's exactly right. That's the conclusion. Why is that? Because human intelligence is a gift from God. Right? Are you starting to see that? So what is the point that somebody's trying to make, and how is that person backing it up? Like I said, it takes a bit of practice. Now, the next one is particularly long, and I included this one on purpose because it looks really convoluted, but the structure is the exact same. Its structure is actually really simple, so let's take a look. To boycott a business or a city as a protest is not an act of violence, but it can cause economic harm to many people. The greater the economic impact of a boycott, the more impressive the statement it makes. At the same time, the economic consequences are likely to be shared by people who are innocent of any wrongdoing and who can ill afford the loss of income: hotel workers, cab drivers, restaurateurs, and merchants. The boycott weapon ought to be used sparingly, if for no other reason than the harm it can cause such bystanders. Long, but simple in structure. So what is the point that the person is trying to make? What is the conclusion? Yes, the boycott weapon ought to be used sparingly, right, if for no other reason than the harm it can cause such bystanders. Everything that comes before that is the reason why. Right, so that's the premise. So all of that top sentences, this is the reason, and therefore the boycott weapon should be used sparingly. Right? Are you starting to get this? So again, this does take a little bit of practice, but man, imagine if you can watch the evening news and kind of take apart, okay, what's the point that they're trying to make, and how are they getting there? When you're talking to your coworkers, right, if he says something, okay, did he tell me just the conclusion, or did he actually give me an argument? If you can do that, you can actually weed through a lot of irrelevant stuff. Like whenever I don't do this very often anymore, but on Facebook, for example, if I get locked into a back and forth, and whoever I'm talking to gives me this long speech about something, this is the first thing that I do. Okay, what's the point that you're trying to make, and how are you backing it up? If I can find the conclusion first, man, like I can weed out a lot of the other stuff. So it's actually really helpful, especially if your friend gives you, or coworker, family, whoever, gives you some long speech, if you can just get to, okay, what's the conclusion first? You don't have to necessarily ask that. You know, what's the point you're trying to make? You can, if you have the right kind of relationship. But if you practice it beforehand, it'll save you a lot of time and headache when you're talking to your friends. Okay, next. Practice identifying assumptions. Because you know what they say about making assumptions. It makes a certain animal out of you and me. What's an assumption? An assumption is something you take to be true already before you say something else, usually without arguing for it. So the question that you should always have in the back of your mind is, okay, what does this person have to believe first before he can say that? Right? The reason for that is because a lot of the times when we say something, it's usually founded on other things that we believe. Sometimes we need to get there, go a little deeper. What's behind the question you're asking? What's behind that statement you just made? So always, what does this person have to believe first in order to say that? So let's do a quick practice. When somebody says, I don't believe in God because I have science, again, what's the question you ask? What does this person have to believe first before he can say that? So let's think about that. What would you have to believe first before saying, I don't believe in God because I have science? Science disproves God. Somebody said that. Yeah, and there was somebody over here somewhere. You have to... Science and God can't go together, right? And was there somebody else farther back who said something? that both can't be true. Okay. So a little bit like, how God and science don't go together kind of thing. Yes, that's good. Anything else? Right. Actually, that's a really important thing. So our friends may have some misconceptions about who God is or what God is. Right? So let's hang on to that, because we're coming to that in the next segment. When it comes to asking questions, there is a particular question that we have to ask in order to draw that out. So let's hold on to that, sir. That's really good. So yeah, a lot of these responses are right. God or religion and science are mutually exclusive. Science can disprove God's existence. God of the gaps. So God of the gaps, if you've never heard that before, what it means is it's this idea that our beliefs about God or gods came about because we didn't understand how the world worked. So whenever there was this gap in our knowledge about how the world worked, then we just plug God or gods into it. So, hey, there's a storm. It must be Poseidon. He's angry. Okay, there is this thunder. Thor is having a good day up there. Like things like that. So this is a common view among my friends who don't believe in God, especially those like really strong scientific naturalist types who think this physical world is all there is and science can explain everything. Those kinds of friends, they tend to believe this. God and science are mutually exclusive. That's just not true. What a lot of people don't understand is the fact that modern science came from the crucible of the institution of the university. And the universities arose out of, at least in Europe, right, from monasteries and cathedrals. The cathedral schools of medieval Europe gave birth to the university, and that's where we get modern science from. I'm not saying that Christianity is the only contributor to science. That's not what I'm saying. But if God or religion and science are so mutually exclusive, how is it that modern science came out of cathedral schools of medieval Europe? Galileo, we hear about him in science classrooms, almost always exclusively about his conflict with the church. But what you don't hear about is that he was a devout Christian himself. And the reason the Catholic Church came after him was not so much because of his view that the sun was at the center of the solar system. He was a bit of a jerk. In fact, his book concerning two world systems, where he had the earth-centered view and the sun-centered view, geocentrism, heliocentrism, he was actually a friend of the Pope, and the Pope encouraged him to write this book. But what he did was he wrote this book, and he had two characters, each of them representing one of the world systems. And the one who holds to the older Aristotelian view that the earth is at the center, right? He calls him Simplicio, the simpleton, the idiot. And what does he do? He starts putting the words that the Pope spoke in his mouth. And this is a time, Protestant Reformation, everything, like the church is really sensitive about people challenging the authority of the church. And he is pulling a real jerk move. Is the Pope happy? Of course he's not. Those things you'll never hear. Galileo, Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, Isaac Newton, the fathers of the modern scientific revolution, do you know what they have in common? They were Christians. They were devout Christians. Louis Pasteur, father of microbiology, Christian, right? And so again, tell me, if God or religion and science are so mutually exclusive, how is it that modern science came out of the university, which arose out of cathedral schools and monasteries in medieval Europe? So instead of just arguing at that level of, I don't believe in God because I have science, I want to go a little deeper and see what other things that my friends are believing. I want to go after that. How about this one? I got this from my high school friends a lot. Hey, Steve, why can't you see abortion is legal? Besides, if you don't like one, don't get one. So again, what's the question that we have to ask in the back of our minds? What does this person believe? What does the person have to believe first before he can say that? So tell me, what do you see? Is abortion morally permissible? Right? That's another question, right? What else? This person probably believes the fetus is not a human, or at least not a person, or neither. These days, it's pretty fashionable to make the distinction between human and person. That's a whole other conversation. We can spend hours talking about that, but we won't go there because we don't have the time for it. What else? Right. If something is legal, it's morally permissible. I think you're kind of on the same track there. So that's right. There's a lot of those things in the background. What's legal is also morally permissible. You can't legislate morality, which is not true. The unborn is just a clump of cells, right? Not a human or not a person. So you have to have all these things in place before you can say, well, if you don't like one, don't get one, right? Abortion is legal, right? So instead of just arguing at the top level there, I want to go. So then the question that I would want to raise, if my friend said that, the question that I want to raise is, does legality mean morality, right? If something is legally permissible, legally permitted, then does that mean it's morally permitted? If that's the case, then how do you explain slavery? Because there was a time when slavery was legal. So in your view, does that mean that there was a time in our culture when slavery was moral? Who wants to argue that? You can't legislate morality. That's certainly not true. We have laws against homicide, right? Thou shalt not murder. Well, hello. So the question isn't whether we legislate morality or not. We do that all the time. The question is, whose morality are we going to legislate? The unborn is just a clump of cells. You know who else is a clump of cells? It's me. You. We're all clumps of cells. But we understand that we're more than that, right? But when it comes to the unborn or the preborn, as I like to call them, why is it that they're just a clump of cells and nothing more? Where did you get that from? Nothing more. What happened there? Right? So again, there's a whole lot of, I actually teach a whole thing on pro-life apologetics, but we'll just leave it there. So next one. Okay, so we talked about practice analyzing an argument, practice spotting assumptions, also practice spotting logical fallacies. What's a logical fallacy? It just means an error in reasoning. Error in reasoning. Let's see. There are whole books dedicated to logical fallacies, so I don't have time to go through all of that. But if you want to get a little bit more into this, and you're like, man, like I'm a newbie at this, there is a book called Detective Fallacy. It's a really good book for children and adults. And it gives you all kinds of different examples and why that reasoning doesn't work. So there's that book, Detective Fallacy, but there's another book called An Illustrated Book of Bad Arguments. Also good for children and adults. So check those out if you're interested in getting more. I'm just going to give you just a few examples. There is a fallacy called ad hominem. It's Latin for literally against the person. So that error is trying to use personal attacks to rebut an argument. Rather than going after the argument, you just attack the person's character, question the person's motives, whatever it might be. So that's ad hominem has a couple of different varieties. This one's called ad hominem abusive, where you just attack the person's character or, just everything is directed against the person. Ad hominem abusive. So you might have had this kind of a conversation, or you might have seen this somewhere in the netherworld of social media. So let's say the woman says, I think assisted suicide is wrong because of A, B, and C. Notice that this woman just offered not just a claim, an argument, right? She made the point, right? She made the claim, assisted suicide is wrong, and then she gave the reasons because of A, B, and C. Now, if you get involved in, again, a social media back and forth, almost always somebody will say something like what this guy's going to say and says, well, you're so naive. You obviously have never seen anyone suffer intolerably. Have you seen that before? I have seen that lots of times. Whenever there is a conversation on social media, someone out there is saying, you are so naive for being against assisted suicide. So notice, she offered an argument. He's just calling her naive. Does he deal with her argument, or is it just a personal attack? So this is called ad hominem abusive. It's just a personal attack. So in this case, you might raise questions and say, okay, let's just grant you that I am naive. I would disagree with that, but let's just go with that. I am naive. What do you think about what I just said? That because I think assisted suicide is wrong for these reasons, what do you have to say about these reasons? So bring it back to your argument. You can do that. How about this one? This one's called, this is another variety of ad hominem. It's called ad hominem circumstantial. But for mere mortals like us, all it just means is questioning the motive. Questioning somebody's motive is not a refutation of that person's argument. So in fact, this Facebook comment came from a friend of mine from Bible school. He and I, let's just say that we don't see eye to eye on many, many things, theologically or politically. So somebody posted this National Post article by Rex Murphy. You guys all know Rex Murphy, right? Many of you do. He's a political commentator. So he writes an article for the National Post titled White Privilege on the March, where he actually argues that white privilege isn't real. Okay? And then my friend comes along and says, oh, look, a white intellectual pointing out that there's no such thing as white privilege. Fascinating. And you'll see that sort of thing. Technically speaking, my friend has committed the fallacy of ad hominem circumstantial, questioning the motive. Now, when you talk to friends who are deep into critical theories, whether it's critical race theory, critical gender theory, queer theory, whatever it might be, they'll almost always go there because they believe the arguments that you make are not detached from the circumstances that you're brought up in. That's where the whole systemic racism and everything comes in. But strictly speaking, that is a fallacy. Now, they might say, well, you say it's a fallacy because you have bought into the white Western-centric view of logic, so on and so forth. But that doesn't change the fact that the integrity of your argument is still there. You have to deal with that. So again, I might bring it back, well, let's just say that, yeah, that's how I think. But what do you think about the points that I just made? Do you think they're valid? Do you think they're true? Again, bring it back to the argument. How about this one? This is another, this is called genetic fallacy. You might have had somebody say something like this to you. If you had been born in Saudi Arabia, you would have been a Muslim. Likewise, if you had been born in India, you'd likely have been a Hindu. The reason you're Christian is because you were born in Canada. Have you heard that sort of thing before? Yeah. Strictly speaking, that's a fallacy. It's called genetic fallacy, and you commit the genetic fallacy when you try to invalidate somebody's belief or argument by pointing out how that person came to believe it. So let me illustrate it to you this way. Let's careful how I ask this. But how many of you here believe that the earth revolves around the sun? Right? Okay, I see a few hands going up. Okay, everybody's shy. That's okay. Right? Now, what if somebody said this to me? Steve, the reason you believe that the earth revolves around the sun is because you were brought up in a culture that actually teaches you that. Okay? My response to that is okay. Does that mean the earth doesn't revolve around the sun? Right? Because at the end of the day, that's the point, right? Does it revolve around the sun or not? Or do we just stay stationary? I mean, like, what is it you're trying to say? This is how I came to believe it. I do a whole session on truth, how truth works. Let me just, it's like an hour-long session. Let me just distill it for you in 5 seconds. Truth, what is truth? Truth is when there's a matching relationship between what you say, think, or believe and the way things actually are. Right? Truth is when there's a matching relationship between what you say, think, or believe and the way things actually are. So if I have this thought in my mind that Pastor Bruce has this beautiful lock of black hair, that thought does not match what actually is the case. Right? So you would call that false. But if I have this thought that his son Parker has this flaming red hair, that matches reality, right? And so you call that true. You can't invalidate that truth by pointing out how I came to believe that, right? Because how I came to believe it has nothing to do with whether there's a matching relationship between what I believe and the way things actually are. The idea that the earth revolves around the sun, if there's a matching relationship between that and the way things actually are, that's what makes it true, not how I came to believe this. Do you see the relationship there? That's why the genetic fallacy fails. Yeah, often there's a stereotype involved, right? This is how you're brought up, so this is, right? And the thing with stereotypes, you have to hold it with an open hand, right? And in this case, this person royally misses the point. Okay, so tomorrow I'm going to give a talk on, it's a historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. So if I'm right in making that argument, it doesn't matter how I came to believe it. The question you have to ask is, that case that you just made, Steve, does it match the way things actually were? How I came to believe it has nothing to do with the truth value of the case that's made. Again, there are lots of fallacies out there. There are books, entire volumes written on fallacies. But pick up something like The Fallacy Detective and start working through that. And again, in your daily conversations, if you spot fallacies, just take note of them. And please don't go after them like, hey, that's the genetic fallacy, or that's the tu quoque fallacy. You're not going to make very many friends if you do that. So just take note of it in the back of your mind. This is actually a really, you know where you can really practice this is if you watch a parliamentary proceeding. And it's like, dude, that's like ad hominem circumstantial, ad hominem abusive, genetic fallacy, tu quoque fallacy, like look who's talking kind of fallacy. Or the guy's just missing the point. And like there is a particular politician that I see on TV from time to time, and whenever I see him in some kind of a House of Commons setting where he's receiving questions, I've never seen him actually directly answer a question. It is really frustrating, but it's also a really good place where you can practice spotting logical fallacies. Political debates, just in general, these days, is just full of these things. It's quite, I don't want to say delightful, but you have that feeling where you go fishing somewhere and you have lots of fish to catch. That's what it feels like. Next, this is the really fun part, because now let's say you have the mindset, you've been preparing for this. Now you actually get to sit down with a friend or a coworker or a family member. What are some things that you can do? I take a lot of this material from a book by that title, actually, called Tactics by Greg Koukl. Greg Koukl, Koukl. The book is called Tactics, and I think the subtitle is something called A Game Plan for Sharing Your Christian Convictions, or something like that. Now, Greg Koukl is a Christian. He's interested in conversational evangelism, but what you're going to see is really going to help in just any conversation that you're in. So let's see what we can do. If you actually sat down and you're talking to people, right, you basically want to ask lots of questions. And there are 3 big questions that you can ask. The first one is, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by blank? Right? Earlier, sir, you mentioned that, when you're talking to your friends, they might have some misconceptions about God. That's absolutely true. Right? What this question does is that it actually helps define the terms that you're using. Because if you don't define terms and you use the same word and mean something totally different by it, guess what you're going to do? You're going to do one of these. Like passing ships in the night. You're going to talk past each other. So if my friend says, well, I don't believe in God, I don't think he's real, almost always I want to ask, what do you mean by God? And almost always, my friends, especially, again, those types who think science can explain everything and this natural world is all there is, give me some examples of what God is like. They'll give me a list of pagan gods like Zeus, Thor, Loki, right? Molech, Dagon, and they like to bring up some really obscure ones from Mesopotamia that you've never heard of. So then it's a real problem, because what we mean by God is totally different. Because what I mean when I say God is somebody who is infinite, almighty, all-powerful, all-knowing, creator of the cosmos, right? Who is both transcendent and immanent, all those things. My friends, what they're talking about is finite beings that are bound to space and time in some way. That's very, very different. It's not just a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind. So if that's what my friend mean by God, and if this is what I mean by God, we have to clarify terms. Right? So, for example, there is this guy, Lawrence Krauss. He's a theoretical physicist from Arizona State University. He's a very vociferous atheist. He doesn't believe in God. He wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing, right? And he wrote in this book that a universe can and will come from nothing because, are you ready for this? Because nothing is unstable. So what's the question we should be asking? What do you mean by nothing? Right? Because what you realize as you're reading becomes pretty clear that what he means by nothing is not anything, but what he means by that is quantum vacuum. Quantum vacuum, my friends, is not nothing. It's a sea of roiling energy. So when we say, right, nothing, it's a term of universal negation. Not anything, not even quantum vacuum. So what do you mean by, keep that question in the back of your minds, because this is what happens to me. Whenever I find that I'm not really quite, I don't seem to be on the same page with my friend, this is the first thing I do. Is there a term that my friend is using that seems a little unclear, right? Maybe I think it's clear, but maybe he means something different by it, right? So I kind of go through a checklist of, okay, what are some of the words that my friend used? Is there a word where we're doing one of these, right? So I might just ask, hey, what do you mean by such and such? Can you explain to me? You use this word. Can you help me understand what you mean by that? Can you give me some examples of it, maybe? Right? What do you mean by blank? Next question. What do you mean by that? Oh, sorry. Why do you believe that? Or where'd you get that from? Now, what this question does is actually asks the other person to bear the burden of proof. The burden of proof. What's a burden of proof? The burden of proof is the responsibility that you have to show that what you believe is true. Who bears the burden of proof? Usually, not always, but usually, the person who makes the claim bears the responsibility then to show that that claim is true. Christians are often too good at bearing the burden of proof that doesn't belong to us. So, for example, one of my friends from high school who was a pretty vocal atheist, right? You might have had conversations like this where your friend says, well, I don't think God exists. I don't think God is real. And you ask, well, how do you know that God isn't real? And then your friend flips it back and says, well, how do you know that God is real? Have you had a conversation like that? I've had lots of those. Notice what happened. Who made the claim? My friend did. I don't think God exists. God does not exist is the claim that was made. So I'm asking him to back it up, right? So why do you believe that? But my friend is putting this back on me and saying, no, you tell me why you think God exists. Now, there could be some other things happening back there, but I might say something like, knowing what I know now, back then I didn't know how to deal with this, but I might have said something like, well, I do have my reasons for thinking that God does exist, and I'd be happy to share them with you. But I'm just curious because you made the claim that God doesn't exist, or at least you don't think so. And I'm just curious why you think that. So would you care to tell me why you think God doesn't exist? Just put it right back where it belongs. You don't have to be mean about it. None of these things are meant for you to be mean. But asking good questions calmly with a kind tone can go a long way in having a good conversation. So for example, if somebody says, hey, you know what, Steve, I don't doubt that you're a peaceful person, but it remains a fact that the main cause of war in the world is religion. Look at what's going on in Israel, or look at 9/11. Religion makes otherwise decent people to do extreme things. I mean, no offense, but I think if we can just get rid of religion, I think the world would be a more peaceful place. Right? A whole lot of claims were made. So my question is what? Why do you believe that? Or where'd you get that from? You said religion is the main cause of war in the world. Where'd you get that from? And just bite your tongue and wait. You don't have to answer for your friend or family. It is that person's responsibility, right? So just wait for that person's reply. At any rate, you don't want to just put your words in that person's mouth anyway. So just wait for that person to reply. And it turns out there is this book called Encyclopedia of Warfare. There's a few books by that name, but there's one by Axel, I forget the name now. But anyway, these two authors, what they did was they basically did the bean count on the wars in recorded history, and they analyzed the causes, and their conclusion was religion counts for 7% of all warfare in history as the direct cause of this warfare. The other 93%, other causes, resources, power, politics, land, racism, nationalism, right? Whatever it might be. But it's just not true that religion is the main cause of war in the world. How about another one? This is becoming more popular, much to the chagrin of actual New Testament scholars. Hey, Steve, Jesus probably didn't even exist as a historical figure. It's just a Jewish copycat version of pagan dying and rising gods. Has anybody watched this documentary called Zeitgeist? It was a while back. Yeah, Cedric, you watched that one, yeah. It was a while back. But it was a bit of a conspiracy theory kind of documentary that was in 3 parts, and the first part was all about religion, and in particular Christianity. And in that, Peter Joseph, that's not his actual name, the maker of the documentary, makes the claim that Jesus is just a Jewish copycat version of all these other pagan gods who died and rose again in 3 days, right? Horus, born on December 25th, had 12 disciples, did miracles, died, and rose again in 3 days. Mithras, born of a virgin on December 25th, did miracles, died, rose again in 3 days. And he goes through a number of those things. When you actually look into them, that's not at all true. Mithras, born of a virgin, well, the Roman version of Mithras was born from a rock. So I guess you could call it a virgin birth. I don't know. But that doesn't sound like any virgin birth that I know. So when you actually look into that, it's not at all true. And to just about, so this idea that Jesus was not a historical figure is so fringe that no New Testament scholar who teaches at an accredited university believes it. Or maybe there might be like 1 or 2 of them. Like I can count on one hand how many scholars actually believe that proposition out of thousands of them in one hand. So again, if somebody makes a claim like that, why do you believe that? Or where'd you get that from? Where'd you get that? Where did you get the idea, for example, that Horus was born on December 25th? Right? The Bible doesn't even say that Jesus was born on December 25th. It doesn't tell us when he was born. And if anything, it's pretty clear that he wasn't born during winter, because the shepherds were out in the field, is usually the argument, and you wouldn't have done that in the winter time. But there is a reason we picked December 25th. Lots of historical reasons, traditional reasons, and all of that. I won't get into that quite yet. But one really cool reason is that December 25th comes right after the longest night of the year, right? Winter solstice, December 21st, when the night is the longest. And this is around the time when the day starts to get longer. And what do we call Jesus? The light of the world. The light that, according to John 1, the light that has come to darkness. And darkness has not overcome it. Right? So there are other theological reasons why we chose December 25th. That and many other reasons. So none of this really makes sense if you actually start looking into it. But again, it's not your job necessarily to refute all of that. But you can just simply ask, okay, where'd you get that from? And why do you believe that? Right? Ask that person to bear the burden of proof. We're coming to an end here, so just hang in there with me. Third question. Have you ever considered the possibility that, or, hey, I'd love your reaction on this. What do you think about X, Y, and Z? So this is the kind of question that you use to present your own views. Right? So have you considered the possibility that, and then you insert your own views, and then guess what you're doing? You're giving it to the other person for feedback. I'd love your reaction on this. What do you think about? Right? So, the purpose of this is you want to propose your view in a respectful way. It's a respectful way in a sense because you're actually asking that person's feedback. You're not just saying your bit. You're not just saying your bit, you're actually giving it to that person for feedback. So what about, for example, again, let's use the example of an abortion. Hey, Steve, I think abortion should be allowed in the case of rape and incest. One response might be something like this. It's just a possible reply. You don't have to say it exactly like this. You want to use your own voice, your own words, but I might say something like, yeah, I see what you mean. Like the word tough doesn't even begin to describe the situation there, does it? Right? And with that, and imagine, raising a child with that kind of trauma attached to it. Like, it'll be difficult. With that said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Some would say that the unborn child is an innocent bystander to the crime and shouldn't be killed. What do you think of that? I'm not doing the heavy lifting here. I'm just asking my friend's opinion on this. And he might have, or she might have, some thoughts on this. Then, given what that person said, maybe first paraphrase it, give it back to her, make sure you understood that correctly. Is this what you're saying? If that person says yes, it's like, okay, then you pick it up from there and keep moving. Does that sort of make sense? So the last couple of really quick things. What do you do when you come across a steamroller? So for example, you're in a bit of a heated discussion and your friend is just steamrolling you. You can't get a word in edgewise. Just think of the acronym RAW, R-A-W. R stands for establish the rules of the conversation. So if your friend is really excited about something and you're having a hard time saying anything, you might want to stop your friend and say, hang on a second. Seems like you and I both have a lot that we want to say on this, but if we just kind of talk over each other, I don't think we're going to have a very good conversation. So how about we do this, right? You can have 5 minutes and say what's on your mind, and then after that 5 minutes, like I'll ask you a couple of questions, and then we reverse it. I'll say what's on my mind for about 5 minutes, and then you can ask me a couple of questions. And we just kind of take turns. Can we do that? And the key thing that you want to do is you want to get an agreement out of that person, right? And most of the time they'll say, yes, let's do that, right? Very few people will say, no, I don't want to have a good conversation with you, right? I don't want to have a rational conversation with you. Very few people will actually say that. So you establish rules for the conversation. Now, typically what happens is, because this is an emotional reaction, it's like a big freight train, right? It's really hard to slow down and stop. You can't stop it immediately. Your friend might, start steamrolling you again, in which case you do the A, keep that person accountable. So what you do is you remind that person of the rules of the conversation that you just agreed on. And say, hang on a second. Yeah, I can see you're passionate about this, so am I. We both have lots that we want to say about this, but do you remember we agreed to take turns? So can we do that, please? Right? And again, if that friend just keeps steamrolling you, then you just walk away. And you might say something like, hey, listen, clearly this is an emotional topic. We have lots on our hearts and minds that we want to say to each other, but this conversation just isn't being very productive. So how about we take a break and maybe revisit this issue when cooler heads prevail, right? And just leave it there and walk away. So establish the rules of the conversation, get an agreement out of it, and then keep that person accountable. And if that's still not going anywhere, you just kind of walk away. Here's something that I'd like to say. In my line of work, I've seen two people with sort of equal but opposite extreme mistakes, mistaken views about apologetics. One side thinks apologetics is of no value whatsoever. It's a matter of faith, they say. And, arguments never brought anyone to the kingdom, which is not true. But they see no value in apologetics. But then there's the other extreme end where I've actually had people tell me something like, well, if I just give him the right argument, right, he's going to accept Jesus. I'm like, no. And the reason for that is because God created us way more complex creatures than just thinking beings. Rationality is an important aspect of who we are, of being human, but he has also created us emotional creatures, right, volitional creatures. So there could be any number of reasons why our friends and family and coworkers reject Jesus. Maybe the problem isn't up here. The problem is here. And so when I talk to my friends, one key thing that I try to keep in the back of my mind is, what is the question that this person is actually asking behind the question? So let me give you an example. When it comes to the question of evil and suffering, I almost never answer it directly. So my wife's best friend, Caitlin, lives in BC. A number of years ago, her 2-year-old niece died of bone cancer. 2 years old, died of bone cancer. So when I raise the question, why does God allow evil and suffering? I might be asking that question from an intellectual standpoint. But do you think my wife's best friend, when she says, why does God allow evil and suffering? Exact same question, exact same words, but she means something totally different by it. Because that's not what really she's asking, right? What she's asking is, why did God let my 2-year-old niece die from bone cancer? So there's sometimes question behind the question. Another quick story was a bit of an aha moment. When I first moved to Alberta about 6 years ago, I was invited to speak at this one church to the youth group, and I was speaking on the existence of God and some of the reasons why we might believe that. And at the end of the evening, this one young female student, about 16 at the time, I believe, came up to me and started asking me about carbon dating in Genesis 1 and those kinds of things. So I gave her what quick answers I could give her at the time. And then the next day, I ran into my sister-in-law, who happens to live across the street from me, and she was also serving the youth at that church. She told me what had happened that week at her school, in her science class, where her science teacher just went off on Christians, saying, basically, if you're going to succeed in science as a Christian, you've got to give up these childish things about the world being created in 6 days, and it just doesn't. That's just not true, right? It's going to mess up your science, right? And he went on and on and on, and so she's trying to speak up, and she's looking around the room at her youth group friends for backup, but they're all keeping their heads down, and I don't blame them. Like, what can you do against your teacher? So when I heard that, I was like, no, she wasn't asking me about carbon dating at all. She was asking me whether a Christian can be a good scientist. So then I sent her an email, CCing her parents, because that's the appropriate thing to do. So I knew that her parents, and I talked to them, got permission, CC'd them, sent an email to her, and gave her a quick crash course on the history of modern science. A lot like what I said earlier about the cathedral schools of Europe, and about guys like Francis Bacon, who came up with the scientific method, was a Christian, right? And all that sort of thing. And I said, yes, you can be a Christian and be a very good scientist, because we have a track record of good scientists who will tell you in their own words that it was their faith that drove their science. So I try to keep in mind. So when we're having an issue, something is not working in this conversation, I might have to take a step back and say, the problem might not be up here. The problem might be here. We're complex creatures, and so don't be surprised if your friend, coworker, or family member doesn't respond to your logical arguments, because that might not be where the problem is. Do you remember the book of Job, right? And his friends coming to him. Notice what happened, right? Job just lost everything. And then what little he had, his own health, that's gone too. Boils breaking out everywhere. Have you had boils before? I have, and it really hurts. When I was living in Korea, I had whatever this bug was, I got it, and I had it in my bum and one here. And, oh, that hurt. I can't imagine being covered in all of that, and then scratching my skin with broken pottery, right? And then dogs coming in. I mean, he's hitting the lowest of the low. His 3 friends come. The first thing they did right. Do you remember what it was? What did his friends do? The first thing. They sat there with him in silence and mourned with him. That's the best thing they could have done. Because what Job is going through is not, his problem isn't up here. It's here, right? Why is God doing this to me? And his friends are theologizing now, right? After about a week, Job, you must have done something wrong. God is punishing you for this. So you need to fess up, right? And make a sacrifice and all of that. And Job says, no, I haven't done anything wrong. Why is God doing this to me? I need to speak to God. I want an audience with him. Let God appear before me, right? And what happens? God does appear before him. Does he answer any of his questions? No. God has questions of his own. Job, where were you when I was setting the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I was setting the boundaries of the ocean? Do you know how these things work? And Job's like, for historical accuracy, he said, perhaps, oh crap. And Job says, Lord, I have spoken out of ignorance. I am destined. I'm so sorry. But God says, I'm not done. And then he gives him more questions, right? And in the end, Job understands. He finally understands a little bit more about who God is. You know what's really interesting at the end of the book of Job? God gets mad at his friends. You guys spoke into things that you had no idea, right? And then what he tells his friends is, you go to my righteous servant Job, he's going to make a sacrifice for you and I'll accept it. Let's not be like Job's friends. There might be a time for that kind of intellectual conversation, but maybe the problem is here. If we have problems up here, we need theologians, we need philosophers. If we have problems here, that's the domain of counselors and pastors. And you don't have to be a professional counselor, but maybe what that friend really needs is just for you to listen. Bit of a going sideways here, but I'll give you this last one. Has nothing to do with abortion. What if you come across somebody who knows way more than you, right? So maybe you're sitting on an airplane, you start talking with the gentleman next to you, and you start talking about the existence of soul. And turns out this guy has a PhD in philosophy in the area of the body-mind problem in philosophy. And you are outmatched. What then? Well, the best thing you can do is be a student. Don't try to argue that person. Don't try to win an argument. Don't try to win score. Don't try to win points. Just listen, learn as much as you can, and then at the end, there's a magical phrase that's going to get you off the hook, and as soon as I say this, you'll see why it closes the conversation. And after learning from this person as much as they can, you might say something like, thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's a lot that you have given me a lot of really good things to think about. So now let me think about it. See how that closes the conversation? Right, this gentleman or this gentle lady, whatever the case might be, might want to go on further. Listen respectfully, learn as much as you can, and you might say, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Like I said, it's a lot of really good stuff to think about, and my brain is pretty full. Clearly, you're well learned in this. So let me kind of chew on that a bit. Let me think about it. Do you see how it closes the conversation? So sometimes, if you need to end the conversation, just maybe keep that in the back of your mind. But again, notice that your attitude and how you posture yourself really matters a lot. If you come out swinging at that person, it's really hard to then humble yourself and say, you know what, yeah, you've given me a lot of good stuff to think about. Let me think about it. That's why you need to have a charitable view of the person, because then you're not going to, hopefully, come out just swinging at the person, trying to beat this person down with an argument, like quarreling kind of an argument. Because you can win arguments and lose the person. Let's not do that, right? And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Let me think about it. That's the last of it. Should I invite you back up here? I think he has something that he wants to say.
first, let's begin by thanking Steve for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. When you recognize you're outmatched, you say, give me some time to think about that.
Yeah.
So thank you. I'm going to do
Thank
that
you.
tonight. All right. We're going to have some snacks out in the foyer, some coffee, some tea, some great homemade cookies. You have about 10 minutes. Just go out, get some refreshments, stretch your legs, and we're going to come back in here for question and response time. We're just going to, open the floor to questions. We'll make sure that a microphone is taken to whoever's asking the question so that everybody can hear the question. So give yourselves about 10 minutes, stretch your legs, use the bathroom, and then we'll come right back in here in 10 minutes.